Hi folks, this is Andrew Rupe, agronomist with Golden Harvest covering East Central Iowa. And this week's weekly agronomy video topic is covering corn dry down and also soybean harvest. So first we're going to talk about corn dry down. And corn dry down is really that period in the corn's life cycle where we've hit black layer and now we're just trying to get the moisture out of the grain to a lower level where we can actually store that grain in bins, silos, any type of storage that we have for that grain, down to that 15% moisture level, whether we're doing that out in the field or we're doing that artificially with a dryer setup. So a couple of the things that can impact the dry down of the crop. Obviously there's some environmental factors. If we have warmer weather, drier weather, lower humidities, and then also some wind and some breeze that kind of can help move some of the air around that crop, that will help to dry down and bring the moisture out of the grain of the crop. Now, a couple of the things that will impact the dry down of the crop are some of the characteristics of the hybrid or the plant itself. So things like husk coverage will impact the dry down of the crop. If we have a hybrid that has a very loose husk, an open husk, and maybe a little bit of a shorter husk on it, will allow a little bit more air movement over those kernels and into that layer in between the grain and the husk to allow some of that moisture to be pulled out of the crop and allow that corn to actually dry down a little bit more. Other things that will impact it too are also the orientation of the ear, whether it's tip up or tip down. If we have a hybrid where the ears are tipped up, that's very, very good before we get to black layer, because we don't want to pinch that shank and stop the flow of nutrients. But once we've hit black layer, and now that we're in that dry down period, if we can get those ears to tip down, generally we'll get a little bit better dry down out of that crop. We don't allow for, what that does is any excessive moistures that may be accumulating on the grain or on the husk, whether that's via dew in the morning or rainfall, it'll actually just allow some of that moisture to fall down and release itself from the husk and not sit in the ear and in the husk of the plant. So that's a little bit on some characteristics of dry down, some things to watch out for, some things around harvest of your crop though at this stage. We typically will see better or less harvest losses whenever we harvest right around that 20 to 22 to 24% moisture range on the crop. We don't have quite as many head losses on the head whenever we pull that ear down and then it hits the deck plates of the combine and potentially have some shelling via that way. We'll have less of those losses whenever we harvest a little bit on the wetter scale and not allow too much dry down out in the field. Now let's talk about soybean harvest. So now we're talking about soybean maturity and soybean harvest. And many of us can kind of tell, even from driving along a field, when a soybean crop is potentially ready to be cut. One thing that we need to be cognizant of is actually checking the pods of the plant, and is that our true indication of maturity. Sometimes in some soybean fields we can see green stems and leaves still hanging on the plants, but those pods are actually mature and those beans within those pods are mature. In those cases we are ready to harvest. We may just have to slow down and cut a little bit slower to get through those green stems and to get through some of that leaf material that's there. And I get a lot of questions, especially this year where we've had a stretch of dry weather where beans have gotten down in moisture, down to that 10% or even lower range. Do I stop? Do I keep going? It's a very, very tough call for guys. In many situations, you end up losing some yield because you don't actually get paid for that lower moisture when you deliver those beans to the co-op or to the elevator. However, what you can run into is some issues with shatter loss in the beans if we leave those out there and we leave it exposed to a few more wet dry cycles on that soybean crop. The more and more of those wet dry cycles, if we get rainfall in between there, that can lead to pods bursting open and leaving soybeans out in the field before we're able to actually cut them. So it's a very difficult call whether or not you should continue whenever those beans are getting dry, or if you should be waiting for a little bit moisture to be put back in those beans with a rainfall or a dew or something like that. My suggestion is to look at the forecast, identify how many acres you have left to harvest, where you're at in the calendar. Those are some of the things that you're gonna have to balance out and weigh out on whether or not you continue to harvest whenever those soybeans are dry, or you shut the combine down, switch to corn, and wait for some moisture to be put back in those beans. If you got any questions about that or need some suggestions on soybean cutting, what your time frame looks like, or corn dry down, what your moisture levels are looking like for a certain hybrid, reach out to your local Golden Harvest seed advisor, sales rep, agronomist, GHX specialist.